Hello and welcome to Ad and PR Account Management J364 Online, Week 14. I'm your instructor, Michael Betker. Let's get into it. So fortunately for you guys, this is not a very long one today or this week, but I wanted to go through a few things with you guys here now. First and foremost, obviously, we want to talk about the book report. I just finished grading that. Sorry for the delay there. It took me quite a while to get that done, and I've just been overwhelmed with grading. So I appreciate your patience with me as I try to stay on top of things. I pretty much have been chained to my desk since this COVID thing happened. So I appreciate your patience there. So we'll talk about that first, and then I want to talk about assignment 5, which is essentially the last of 5 assignments, which is related to a resume. So we'll talk a bit about that, and then I've got a short lecture on a portion of Chapter 7, which is entitled The Business of New Business. And obviously, Chapter 7 is a pretty big chapter, so I encourage you guys to read the whole chapter. I'm going to focus on a portion of the Chapter 7, which focuses on what's called the 11 Deadly Sins. And part of this idea of getting business is also retaining business. So having an idea of the life cycle of a relationship with a client and kind of like a relationship, frankly, like, there's a birth, you go through, growing pains and so on and so forth, all the way through to death. Being mindful of that process and the cycle of relationship that we go through in anything, frankly, is important for us to know. So we'll talk about the 11 deadly sins. And then, of course, the last thing I'll talk about briefly is our number 9 of 10 posts, the 11 deadly sins. And by the way, discussion post number 10 is also up there as well. And that one I'll just give you a quick precursor on is one of my favorite movies about advertising. It's called Art and Copy. This movie is really about, they talk with old school advertising folks, and there's a lot of great examples in there. So a real fun way to finish this course. So anyway, let's proceed here. So let's first talk about your book reports. So I know it's not always easy to record these things at home, and normally I would have encouraged you guys to find a spot, maybe in Heidi or somewhere, to find an open room and then do it the right way, have somebody sitting in the audience and do it that way. Now, obviously, we have everybody in lockdown, so I gave everybody a hall pass on a number of people in the audience, and frankly, how you recorded it was sort of out of your control in a lot of cases, so I didn't take a lot of points for those types of things, but nonetheless, I was looking for certain things I want to talk about with you guys here, so we don't make those mistakes if we do plan on improving for our final presentation, our creative pitches. So, like I mentioned before, speech 110, all the basics that you learn there, right? Keeping your feet still, making good eye contact, facing the audience, all of those things sort of at the core are what we look for account managers. And the big one here, which is not listed here, for me is being able to speak extemporaneously. I know I've kind of beat this drum quite a bit, and a lot of you guys did a really, really good job of that, just kind of riffing in and around these ideas. A couple things that go on with that. Obviously, it tells me that you read the book if you can do that. Now, some people read the book and still kind of get attached to a script. My challenge here, if you do one thing in this class and you walk away from college here doing one thing well, hopefully it will be, well, there's 2 things. Let's say writing well, and then, of course, being able to present without reading from note cards or reading from a script. So you got to do your best, right? And I would say this, the key there is practice, practice, practice. The more you practice things, the easier it tends to flow. Another little trick here, too, is just be okay with making mistakes. I think people who are chained to a script tend to be fearful of making mistakes, so they don't allow for any mistakes by providing a script for themselves. That's okay. That does satisfy a certain requirement, I would say. But for me, it's much more important for you guys to just be able to speak fluently and fluidly around a topic. And that's what we look for when we make the pitch, right? We're looking for folks who, in fact, you won't be allowed to bring note cards into any meetings when you go make the pitch when you're working for an agency. So just be aware that you got to wean yourself off those cards and off any scripts you've written, okay? So I would have noted that, and I think in most cases I can kind of tell if you're using a script. So do your best to wean yourself off that for this next presentation we have coming up. Ultimately, what I'm looking for, obviously, again, we're kind of not able to do this in the right way, but cultivating an intelligent conversation. I know we did this digitally, and obviously you guys are in your groups, and I saw some good discussion around each of the presentations, so thank you for that. But we want to cultivate a good, intelligent discussion that hopefully drives questions and answers and a good dialogue back and forth with your book report. And by the way, the content was awesome. I thought everybody picked great books and really interesting stuff. And one selfish thing for me is I always get to learn new stuff from you guys. So you taught me a lot during the course of this thing. And I did watch everybody's presentations from beginning to end. That's why it took me so long to get these things done. Don't read from the slides. Obviously, that's something I already mentioned. A lot of you guys looked at the bullet point and then were able to expound upon that. So that's what we want, right? We want you to do that. Like I said before, if you do it 10 times, if you practice it 10 times, you might have 10 different versions of that. But the 11th time you practice it, it's probably going to be a composite of all the best things you've said. That's why practice is key. So practice, practice, practice. The other one I want to say, and this is a 110 thing too, think through your transitions. Lots of folks kind of don't do that very well and always think, gosh, I'm going to say this on this slide. What's my pivot? What's the thing I'm going to say to get me to that next slide? So a lot of folks come up with clever sort of turns of phrase or even just thinking about how you lay out each slide so that one thought leads to the other kind of thing is important. But for me, what I usually do, if I'm not sure, I always put at the bottom of a slide key takeaway. So the one thing on the slide I want them to remember, that key takeaway then, of course, naturally would lead them to the next point on the next slide. So that's another little trick you can do there. Either way, no matter what happens, be confident, enthusiastic about your brand, product, or service that you're talking about, even if it's, like I used to be, worked for a company that sold pumps for a long time, and it wasn't always easy to get up and say, gosh, I can't wait to go sell some pumps today. Especially if they're, toilet pumps or, sump pumps. But either way, you got to find a way to be confident and enthusiastic about what you're talking about there. And the last one, of course, do your homework now. People choose not to go into great depth on points. And that's a clue, anyway, that you may not have really read the entire book. So either way, you want to do your homework right. And that enables you then to be able to speak extemporaneously. So those are my thoughts on these things here. And again, obviously, this is a class. You're going to get a grade. And most people got really good, pretty decent scores across the board. But the reason you should spend some time on this and building this craft is because it's really central to working in an agency, especially if you're going to be an account person, because you'll be in front of audiences quite often. Even small audiences or big audiences, you've got to be able to present yourself intelligently, and that's what we're talking about here. So good job on those. Looking forward to your creative presentations. All right, assignment number 4. Actually, this is number 5, so that's a mistake there. But resume building, this is the last one. For this assignment, you'll create a resume for the job of your choice. Obviously, if you're an account person, that's great. But even be specific if you want to be a PR account person or an ad account person, or if you want to be a copywriter. Go ahead and pull one together, and maybe you already have one. That makes this an easy 20 points for you guys. But either way, I'd like you to take a fresh look at it if it's something you've already got done and refresh that. By and large, most folks don't have anything. So take some time and try to pull together a resume. Either way, I'll give you guys feedback. This is a nice parting shot for you guys as you wend your way through your careers and then on to something else. But my goal here is to give you something tangible from a resume standpoint that you can use and move forward with. So with 20 points, obviously it's due Sunday, May 3rd. So I've given you a little bit extra time on that at 11:59. So we're right up against it here. So that's due. Get that done a little early if you can so you can focus on your creative presentations. All right, let's talk about Chapter 7 a bit now. I'm not going to go into every detail on each of these here, but I wanted to touch on each of these a bit. Chapter 7 is pretty meaty, and it's broken up into these sections. In search of the ideal client, again, like I said, account folks are also always on the lookout for new clients. And usually it's about networking, frankly, in my opinion. So you meet a client, you meet folks within the client organization who you befriend and because of your good work will recommend you to others. So that's one kind of easy and natural way to cultivate new clients. But a lot of times agencies rely on the account folks to go out and drum up new business. It's a part of their job description. So toward that end, in the hunt, New Business 101, that section talks about that. So I would say that I would encourage you guys to read that as well. And just some of the things here. Now, this book's a little bit dated, but the points made in New Business 101 are still relevant. So extending from there, of course, a short course of new business. And then the one that's highlighted there, evolution of the agency-client relationship, is kind of where I want to focus most. Now, obviously, finding a client takes time, but maintaining a client is equally important, I would say. In some cases, if you think about Marketing 101, it's easier and more cost effective to maintain those customers you have. Same thing with clients, right? So you want to cultivate and maintain those relationships as best you can because it costs a lot to go find a new client or customer. And the last section of the book of this chapter is also dealing with client personalities, which we've touched on quite a bit. So again, what I'm going to talk about here in this lecture is going to be about the evolution of the agency-client relationship. And those are found on page 339 to 347. So roughly 8 pages of content. So not a lot to look at there. I do want you to read the whole chapter, though. All right, so the book in this chapter, in this section, of course, is called Evolution of the Agency-Client Relationship, starting on 339. Talks about what's called the 70-30 rule. And essentially what that is I don't know if you've ever heard of the word Pareto analysis before, but essentially that is a rule of thumb that works in many, many ways. And the way I've always thought about Pareto analysis is when I used to work with sales folks. The basic rule of thumb there was 80% of your business comes from 20% of your customers. Now, the book in this case here is talking about, but a new client may hire an agency with 70% of that decision based on the agency's perceived creative strength. So really, that's where it starts, right? And that's where they'll probably look at your website and look at the customers you've worked with and even the work you've done, which is really how you get in the door. So that's the starting point there, right? And that's, again, an example of a Pareto analysis. All right, so read that chapter. And then, of course, let's talk about the life stages of a relationship between the agency and the client. Something called courtship. Obviously, if you think about this as a relationship like somebody you just met and you want to get to know better. Courtship is an old school term for just asking somebody out on a date. If you haven't heard that before. And then let's say, for example, that date goes very well and you feel a good kismet and a good relationship evolving there. Then you enter into what's called the honeymoon period. I'm sure you guys have heard that before. Everything's perfect, right? They can do no wrong. What doesn't stink, that kind of thing. The honeymoon period certainly foreshadows something that maybe not as pretty. When the gloves come off and the honeymoon period's over, and that's when you see the real deal, right? Now, most relationships, now my wife and I have been married approaching 20 years now. We did have our honeymoon period and certainly went through, obviously it takes work with a marriage, just like anything else. So, but along the way here, I could look at my marriage as an example, and certainly we've had a lot of high productivity during the course of our lives together, having 2 children and building our careers and buying a house together and, just building a family. So again, relationships here, and if you think about that analogy, you're really developing those relationships, those long-term relationships with your client. And of course, invariably, like everything, there's deterioration and breakup. So read through that section as well. And then let's talk about kind of some of the sins. Now, you can prolong this, right? You can prolong that relationship. In a lot of cases, you got these long-standing brands, 200 years plus old brands that have been around forever. And part of that relationship with the agency, if it's something that's long-standing, is because you've got Moses over here who is mindful of some of the sins that could be created to shorten that lifespan of that relationship. So the book talks about 11 of these. Okay, the first one here, the sin of silence. Sin of silence is not listening. Essentially, communication is not just talking, it's also listening. So poor listening and poor communications in general. Now, we're all communication majors, right? So we should know that this is a leg up for us over most folks. So embrace that part of it, right? Embrace not just the communication piece, but also the listening piece. Not managing expectations, certainly, as well as you could. And that a lot of that is just kind of letting things slide and being quiet about stuff. And, of course, not demonstrating value as well as another piece of that. Right. The sin of craziness, number 2. So that's creativity for creativity's sake, all right? So you're around a lot of creative people. Maybe you're playing ping pong. Maybe you're allowed to bring your dog to work. All great stuff, right? So they're purposefully that way because they want to foster creativity. In fact, if you look at the Google campus, right, it's all about fostering sort of this relaxed, safe environment that's also sparks creativity, which is great, all great stuff. But the dark side of that is maybe too over-the-top creative, right? So you got to be careful there. So creative for creativity's sake is basically saying, all right, I'm going to be creative here, but it's not going to be tied or anchored to any strategy. So that's one piece. Of course, offensive concepts as well that border on the offensive for the client. And especially it comes down to what the client might think, right? You may think it's pretty good and pretty cool. And intriguing and out there, and certainly would be groundbreaking for some folks. But if you consider your client, it may be offensive to them. So you have to wear that hat, especially as the account person. Off-target proposals, of course, again, that's within your bailiwick there. That's really at the core what you do here. You make sure that proposal and, of course, the creative brief and all that stuff is dead center. Weird behavior. Generally, again, you've got, some people wanting to let their freak flag fly. And weird behavior certainly needs to be curtailed, especially if you got a very conservative client. So folks who aren't presentable, folks who maybe just look like they rolled out of bed, and creative folks generally tend to be a little bit more iconoclastic in their dress and the way they behave. So again, you gotta make sure you manage that effectively. Now, most folks will understand, creativity demands a certain sort of understanding and appreciation for that lifestyle, but nonetheless, the goal is to balance that well. Number 3, the sin of arrogance is an air of superiority, and that happens a lot, right? You got folks coming in who from an agency, and let's say, for example, you got an in-house marketing arm, and let's say marketing communications is a part of that. And I've seen this happen firsthand, so I can tell you this is real. When you bring an agency from the outside, there's definitely going to be some tension there without even saying a word. They know they're bringing somebody outside to do something that you've already been doing. So you've got to handle that with kid gloves, right? You've got to be very careful not to offend and to involve as much as possible. So an air of superiority is not going to fly in most organizations. That leads to disrespect and other bad feelings, and you're off to a bad start already. So that's a huge one. Number 4, the sin of broken promises, missing deadlines and not delivering on commitments, huge, obviously. And again, we want to promise the sun and the moon and the stars to the client, especially early on, because we want to impress them. Reality is, if you keep it real, in the beginning, and you manage expectations versus making these massive promises that, of course, your creative team has to make good on, you'll do well for yourself. But conversely, if you make these promises and come back and say, can you please get this done? I know you got to stay late tonight, but I really need this by tomorrow morning. That may work once or twice even, but after a while, that's going to become old, and your name's going to be mud within your department. And of course, you eventually won't satisfy the strong demands placed on by the client, and you're going to also kind of piss them off as well. So it's a lose-lose situation there. So again, the goal here is to be realistic about deadlines and delivering on things you can deliver on. Other big one there is quickly, promising things are going to go viral. And I know some of you guys have talked about viral in some of your book reports. Going viral, there's a methodology to that, but you still want to be careful and about what you promise. Number 5, the sin of sloth. So sloppy work, poor budget management, inadequate attention to detail, and so on and so forth. So just laziness, basically, and not following through on stuff. You have to be kind of the one who is the quality control person. So, and that's part of that is too your own work. So, I mean, sometimes we work late hours in this business, and accidents happen or things like that happen. Plan for that as much as you can. Give yourself enough time so you don't make sloppy work. Number 6, the sin of overselling. Again, that sort of relates to number 3 there a little bit, or number 4 rather, broken promises. But overpromising and under-delivering, right? So saying I'm going to do this and this is going to go viral, but then of course nothing near that happens. So that's a big one as well. After a while, that gets old for the clients. Number 7, the sin of complacency. So just, again, that ties a little bit back to sin of sloth, number 5. But neglecting or poor personal service, providing inadequate staffing, all of these things kind of lack concern for the client. Number 8, the sin of neutrality. No direction, no opinion, no passion, no added value. So they hired you for your fresh ideas, right? They didn't hire you to sit back and be a yes man, right? Which is also number 9. They want you to engage and to challenge and to think differently than they've been doing for the years past. So that's the sin of neutrality there. They want you to be proactive and push the envelope. Otherwise, they wouldn't have hired you. Number 9, the sin of appeasement. Being a yes man, not pushing for your beliefs. Again, those are tied to some of these other ones here, but you've got, again, 8 and 9 are kind of linked, I would say, but you want to certainly make sure that you're pushing for that next level for the agency and for the client. Number 10, the sin of disobedience, not heeding the advice of senior agency members, not following protocol, and a host of others. But Obviously we tend to be a bit reckless at times if we're creative, and I think that there's a certain amount of that that's good. But and coloring outside the lines again can lead to some really cool creative. That said, there still are rules to follow, and especially if your client has very conservative views on the rules to be followed. So in other words, not coming late to a meeting is a big one for a lot of agency folks. Just being early being early is on time, I guess. And the last one here, number 11, is the sin of blindness, not recognizing the early warning signs of decay and a broken relationship. So from there, the book kind of leads into these other thoughts, the 22 early warning signs that you might be in trouble with the client. So I'm not going to go through that. I'd like you to read that as well. And again, it's in the same kind of format here. If you follow, you're mindful of these 11 sins here, you can still manage that. Now, in spite of that, you're still going to see decay. It's like a garden. A good analogy is a garden, right? You've got a garden. You want to grow a bunch of really cool vegetables this year. You got to weed that garden, right? So we're constantly removing weeds and making sure that your plot has enough sunlight and water to really grow. In spite of that, you're still going to see some warning signs, things you can't control necessarily. But the last section of this chapter, we'll talk about that. So that's all I got. These 11 deadly sins are featured in this week's discussion post. So I would say read that little section. If you don't read anything else, make sure you read that. And then chapter 7, obviously writ large, is you're going to find some stuff in there on the final. So you want to read the whole chapter, but go ahead and answer that. There's a little vignette again this week. They want you to read through and then tell me which of these deadly sins you think best fit the mistake that the account person is making within that little story there. So, all right, that's all I got for this week. Next week, looking forward to talking to you guys again. Week 15 rather, and we're going to talk a bit more about chapter 9 is what we'll talk about. Chapter 9 is about managing your career, so we'll talk about chapter 9 next week. And I've got some words of wisdom for you guys. It'll more than likely be one of the last lectures we have for this semester. And then, of course, you'll have some time to put your head down and work on your final creative presentation. So, all right, as always, let me know if you have any questions. Good luck this week. Looking forward to seeing your responses to this week's discussion posts, and we'll talk to you soon.